Hello, and welcome to Charted. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about Mercury. So in the last episode, we looked at the inner planets kind of more broadly, and now we're going to dive into the inner planets properly. Right? We're going to actually dive into the planets beyond the sun and the moon. So starting with Mercury, it's the closest planet to the sun, which is going to have some of its kind of own implications, even more so than what we talked about in the last episode. But let's understand Mercury first from just an astronomical standpoint. All right, what do we know about it? Number one, obviously, closest planet to the sun. Right, that means it's going to have the smallest orbit, which means it's going to progress around the sun faster than the other planets just by simple fact that it has a small area to go, basically. Number two, that means as it progresses through the zodiac, it's going to move very quickly, right? Because we're going to see this orbit effectively play out about 3 times a year, roughly. Slightly off, but about 3 times a year. We're going to see 3 retrograde cycles every year for Mercury, which means it's moving past the sun, stationing retrograde, moving backwards across the sun, or really behind the sun, going back, stationing direct, and then moving forward, right? And that's a full orbit when it does that process, and that's going to happen about 3 times a year. Mercury is also a very small planet, right? So it's small, it's fast, and it's close to the sun. Those are kind of the main qualities. Some other things with that, as we noted last episode, because it is in between the Earth and the sun, and because it stays, we watch the full orbit play out in the zodiac, essentially. That means Mercury is always going to be either a morning or an evening star, at least when we can see it. So Mercury is going to deal with things that are often unseen as well as seen, right? Because visibility is a big deal in terms of astrology. It's how we can kind of conceptualize things here on Earth. When something's hidden, right, we tend to not see the effects, or at least not in a tangible, kind of real sort of way. So Mercury is going to deal with this kind of unseen and seen qualities at the same time. Because it's small, it's going to deal with things that are detail-oriented. And when we say it's very fast, it's going to deal with rapidity, with something that's very rapid. And then lastly, this idea that it's very close to the sun. Now, Mercury's retrograde, I do want to cover this kind of seen-unseen bit slightly. Mercury never gets more than about 28 degrees from the sun, which means at most it's going to be 1 sign away, which means if you know somebody's sun sign, you get about a 1 in 3 chance to guess their Mercury as well. So that means Mercury's often going to be very close to the sun, which is good, as we'll see as we further this discussion. Number 2, that means because anything within about 12 degrees of the sun is what we'd consider under the beams. That is, it's too close for us to actually see it. Right? If you ever look up in the sky, anytime you have a plane that kind of flies near the sun, right, from our perspective on Earth, you can't see it, right? The sun's just too bright. And that's the same idea even with the planets, even the moon, right? Even the moon right before an eclipse, you can't really see it until it starts to actually cross in front of the sun because the sun's just too bright. It's too hard to look at. So any planet that's within 12 degrees becomes invisible, becomes unseen. We consider it under the beams. And then, so that's 12 degrees on either side of the sun. And then Mercury is 28 degrees on either side, which means you only got about 16 degrees on either side of the sun where Mercury is actually visible. That comes out to about, I think it was like 58%, if I remember the math. So that's not really that often. I mean, that's more than half, I suppose, but it's a lot of time spent kind of hidden. So Mercury has this weird dynamic then where it's going to be dealing with things that are both seen and unseen pretty often. Additionally, because it retrogrades so often, it's going to have this feeling of moving forward, moving backward, moving forward, moving backward continuously. There's a constant back and forth with Mercury. And again, this will make sense in a second. As we discussed in the last episode, the inner planets kind of represent this gateway between the conscious self, the conscious being, the solar self of the sun, and the subconscious, the real, right? The reflection of the consciousness in reality that the moon is. And Mercury, being the closest planet to the sun, is going to effectively be that first kind of gateway, that first bridge between consciousness and reality. So Mercury's kind of main thing then is to bridge that gap. It's going to be that filter, or really that translator, right? That transmission engine between the conscious and the unconscious, or really just the real, the tangible. If we really were to sum down what Mercury represents, its true kind of thing is just translation. It's about translating. But in this case, what is it that it's specifically translating? Well, as I said, it's translating the things of the spirit, the things of the soul, the things of the consciousness into the physical world in a way that makes sense, that our kind of physical body, our physical being can kind of understand and deal with. So it's going to take our creativity, our potential, our desire, our will, our identity, who we are, and translate it into ways that our body, our mind can kind of understand and interact with. Conversely, it's going to take the external world, or even kind of our internal thoughts and monologue, and translate it into a way that our soul, our spirit, understands. Right? It's kind of that gateway back and forth. I studied computer science, so this may be a bit of a nerdy example, but one way to kind of think of it is when you have a computer program, or really a computer, what you really have is the internal parts are just a bunch of, right, your CPU, your GPU, all that stuff. It's really just a bunch of switches that are on and off, right? That's why you have binary, which is a 1 or a 0. It's just telling all these switches to turn on, turn off. That's all it is. But when you interact with a computer, what you're doing is you're interacting with code that a programmer, right, that's what I studied, would write, that tells the computer, okay, the person clicked the mouse on this little box here, therefore do X, Y, Z, right? Turn these switches, turn them off, turn those ones on, yada, yada, yada. So the software program's only job really is to be this intermediary, this kind of translator between the user's interactions and the computer's actual hardware that does things. And that's kind of what Mercury is for us on a personal level. It acts as this kind of intermediary, this translator between who we are kind of in a very spiritual sense and who we are in a very physical, real sense, but also subconscious sense too, right? It's going to take the things of our subconscious and translate it into a way that our mind and our consciousness can also understand. So Mercury really deals with translation. And because it's so close to the sun, it's the thing that is most, I don't want to say cozy with the sun, but right, it's the easiest thing for the sun to kind of really relate to, right? It's that first level. Now, some other things. Mercury's small, right, which represents small things, which represents what? Details. So how does that play into this idea of translation? Well, part of the translation process is translating the things we experience or see or do, right? We have physical bodies. We feel, we touch, we hear, we talk, we smell, we taste, right? So that translation process is taking those bits of information and translating them into a way that our consciousness understands as we interact with the world. So that means Mercury is going to represent kind of that component, but also that means it's going to represent learning, right? Because when we have say a language, for example, right? You don't just teach somebody, here's Here's the language. Here's how you read it, right? No, you teach them the letters first, the small components, the details. That's how you learn something. That's how we master things, really, is by looking at the small details of something. The people who are experts in their field will have seen enough of all the different details to have mastered all the little nuances, and that's what sets them apart from somebody who's a beginner, right? The beginner doesn't have the experience, doesn't have the knowledge of all the small details of how to do all the different things. So Mercury is going to have this very detail-oriented mind to it, and it's going to represent that kind of ability to learn, ability to pay attention to the details. We'll see this with the Mercury-ruled signs. They're very detail-oriented, right? Each in their own way. So Mercury has this learning quality to it, right? It's how we learn. It's the ways in which we learn, what we're capable of learning. So it's going to represent that, because that, again, it's just an extension of that translation process. Translation also can be something we project out into the world. So it's not just our ability to think and to learn, but it's also our ability to communicate. Because what is communication, right? It's taking our internal thought, our internal idea, and putting it in a medium and projecting it externally. Right? In this case, it's a podcast. I'm talking, so I'm expelling air out of my lungs, it's vibrating my vocal cords, but I'm doing it in such a way, right? There's these tiny little, if you looked at the biology of it, it's these tiny little slight fluctuations of it so that I can project sound in a way that makes sense to you or somebody else, right? And not just communication with speaking, right? You can have things like sign language, right? We could write. We could do kind of artistic, creative, interpretive type stuff, right? That's a way of communicating as well. Also things like facial expressions, right? It tends to be more subconscious, more subtle, but that's another way we express things, the way we communicate things. So Mercury represents all of those little things, for all those ways we communicate. Because again, communication is just a translation of information from one person, one place, right? Their head, their mind, to somebody else. And again, that's something that's very detail-oriented, very nuanced. If we look at Gemini tends to be very, very good at reading people because it notices all the little small, subtle things they do as they speak. Right? So it picks up on things. You see that with Scorpio as well because of where Gemini is in Scorpio's charts in the 8th house, the house of secrets. That's why Scorpios are such good bullshit detectors. But Gemini has this ability to notice these things. Why? Because it's a Mercury-ruled sign, and it's an air sign. It's about communication, right? But Gemini is a different topic for a different day. So Mercury is going to represent translation. It's going to represent thinking, right? And things along with thinking, therefore learning. And it's also going to represent communication and all forms of communication. Now, what else does Mercury rule? Well, because it rules details, that means it's going to rule things like that have nuance, right? Finesse. So historically, Mercury was always associated with what? It was associated with thieves, right? Things like that, pickpockets. Why? Because that requires finesse. It requires technique. It requires subtlety and attention to detail. So Mercury is a planet that will also deal with our very finely tuned technical skills. You want to see somebody who's going to be a master of a very technical craft, they're typically going to have good Mercury or very mercurial-oriented signs, right? Maybe the Mars and Gemini or something like that. Now, one thing with Mercury, right, because it has retrogrades 3 times a year, this means it's looking back, and I'll do a separate episode on retrogrades at some point, but retrograde periods are basically a period of looking back on something, right? If you watch it, all it is the planet is moving backwards through the zodiac. It's covering ground it has already progressed over, right? It's moving back across it. So it'd be like you kind of on a trail going up a mountain and you kind of are on a cutback, right? Cuts back. You kind of look over a path you've already been. But that's the idea. And it's this process of, hey, we're reassessing things. And that's particularly important. And while people kind of make a big hubbub about Mercury retrograde season, yada, yada, we're currently at the tail end of one. But the thing is Mercury, being able to retrograde that often means it's able to look back and reassess things quickly, right? We think about the mind, not the subconscious mind like the moon, but the kind of more thinking-oriented mind of Mercury. And you want a mind that can look back and reassess things, because that's how we learn. That's how we understand things, when we can go back and correct mistakes, when we can go back and look and see, hey, did this make sense? No, it didn't. Okay, let's pull that out and try again, right? So Mercury gives us this strong ability to do that. If you think about the sun's always moving forward. So is the moon, right? Neither of them are really looking back at their mistakes. It takes them a full cycle to get back to kind of, ground they've already covered, which in the case of the sun is a year. The case of the moon is a month. So for those two, the two luminaries, our consciousness, our subconsciousness, or unconsciousness, they require kind of repeated attempts, essentially, at doing something to kind of learn from mistakes. But Mercury says, no, I'm going to look back constantly. I'm going to always be looking back so that I can correct it on the fly, right? And this is very important for our mind. This is why Mercury retrograde is not really as scary as people kind of make it out to be. Like I said, people kind of make a big hubbub about it, and it's not really as big a deal. It can be annoying, but so Mercury's going to have this quality of, right, dealing with kind of speed, right? It's a fast planet. It's moving quickly. But again, think of the mind. Your mind thinks quickly, right? If we had a slow planet representing the mind, we'd be very dumb, dull species. So having this strong Mercury, fast Mercury, means that we can be quick thinkers. We can reassess things, right? We're not hemmed in by, right, being stuck on something. Mercury tends to like it rules two mutable signs, right? Mutable being, they're very reactive and nimble. And that's what you want from Mercury. It's a planet that's nimble and able to kind of fit into a lot of places, do a lot of things. Why? Because it's about our ability to think. And having creative thought allows us to kind of really get out and accomplish a lot of things, move beyond obstacles. Some other things with Mercury, right? I don't like using the mythology of the planets too often because personal experience and just kind of what I see is a lot of people will glom onto the mythology, especially with, I see this with the asteroids, but even with the kind of the OG planets, people glom onto the mythology and then just apply every possible thing from the mythology to a planet, oftentimes in ways that kind of don't make sense. And if we think about, and I don't know the full what came first, it's not something I've studied, but part of the reason that the planets were associated with certain Greek gods and then later the Roman gods, right, were just kind of, the Romans basically just copied the Greek pantheon. But the reason that they were associated with them is because it's the same concept of how they figured out the zodiac. They looked at things, they figured out the meanings, and then they associated something with it that made sense, that people would know and have an easy way to kind of, okay, if I know about X, right, or let's say Aries, for example. Aries is the ram. If I know what a ram is, how they operate, I can understand Aries. It's kind of the same thing with the planets and why they were named that way. Now, there was obviously a bit of a component, a bit more spiritual, mystical, where they did kind of actually see the planets as gods. So there was that aspect of it for sure. But regardless, like I said, I'm not too big on using the mythology because, again, people will use every last bit of the mythology and it just kind of confuses things because it's not really meant to embody what the god represented in its full scope, especially because a lot of those things changed over time as the cultures kind of progressed. So that aside, if we actually look at the mythology of Mercury, right, who was Hermes, was the Greek counterpart. What did he do? What was he? He was the courier god. He was the messenger god. His job was to basically take information from place to place, but also he was the guide. He was the guy that took people from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, or vice versa, right? The realm of the spirit, the realm of the gods, and the realm of humans. So Mercury's job was to have a foot in both places, to be in both places. And if we think about this on a conceptual standpoint, in terms of, again, the sun and the moon, the solar, the conscious, spiritual, the soul quality of us, and the moon kind of representing that physical manifestation of it, having somebody that can bridge that gap, that is, or a planet or a piece of us that can bridge that gap, that's Mercury. That's what it really is about, is needs to have its foot in both sides, which means Mercury needs to be neutral. And so that's what it is. Because if you're going to have your foot in both camps, your foot in both doors, right, you're going to be the arbiter between two people. You can't be biased, because then you're not going to actually have an objective connection between the two, right? It becomes ganging up on, right, 2 versus 1. So you need that objective third party, and that's what Mercury is. So Mercury is extremely neutral as a planet and will tend to take on the qualities of either the sign or the planets it's around very strongly compared to any of the other planets. So if you have a Mercury that's around or ruled by malefics that are particularly potent, right, you're going to get a Mercury that's going to be a bit more mischievous. It's going to use that mind, that thinking, for kind of more nefarious purposes. Might be a good liar, might be a good con artist, right, might be a pickpocket. Whereas if you get a Mercury that's kind of more, right, around the benefics, for example, maybe you get somebody who's just really intelligent, really brilliant scholar, an exemplary lawyer or something. And obviously, right, we all have our ability to kind of choose between good and evil, how we want to use something. But what I'm trying to get at is that Mercury tends to take on the flavor of what it's around. So if it's in your chart and you've got a Mercury that's around malefics, it's going to tend to be more difficult to deal with, right? And any planet in that situation obviously would be, but Mercury in that sense oftentimes will kind of work against you because it will be like it's joining their team. Conversely, if it's Mercury with benefics, it can kind of be like joining their team. And so Mercury is very neutral in that sense. Another aspect is Mercury is kind of seen as childlike, right? It's innocent. Something we've kind of touched on. We'll discuss it more as we get into Venus and Mars especially. But each of the planets has a gender that we would assign them. And Mercury is the lone exception. It is true neutral, right? Not only is it neutral in its objectivity in terms of who it's trying to work for, how good or bad, or I should say rather, how benefic or malefic it is. It's more that it's true neutral in every sense. So that means from a gender perspective, Mercury is neither overly outward projecting or overly inward projecting. It's neither trying to aggress or receive, right? So if you look at Mercury, you're going to see a planet that's, and again, it has a foot in both worlds. Mercury represents this sense of translation, and translation is both taking things in, right? Taking the external world in, translating it so that my mind understands it. I see a tree, right? These green leaves, this branch. My mind now can identify that via Mercury, that it's a tree. And now my consciousness understands, okay, that's a tree. Conversely, if I want to tell somebody, hey, this is a tree, right? I take that idea that's in my mind and speak it or write it, whatever I'm going to do. And again, that's the outward projection. So Mercury does both. So it's both or neither, however you want to phrase it. Mercury does not have a sense of I need to be male or female. It doesn't have a sense of I need to be benefic or malefic. It's purely a translator. It is the intermediary. It is just a thing that kind of goes between and can be used as a purpose or kind of as a tool for any purpose. So Mercury is really, really a helper. And we will see this with the Mercury-ruled signs at their core, they both tend to want to be helpers to other people. Gemini really taking on kind of that more kind of courier, messenger kind of role that was associated with Hermes. And Virgo more the kind of servant. Let me do this for you, right? Let me take care of you. Let me handle these issues for you. Let me plan this out. So that's really the essence of Mercury. It's a very intelligent planet, right? Because it deals with what? Translation. Translation means we're going to take information, we're going to put it into a format that we can understand or that we can help other people understand. So Mercury is about learning, it's about thinking, and all the processes that go into thought. Now, one thing on that thought process, Mercury is not inherently logical, although it tends to want to be logical for sure. Mercury is, and I'll mention this in a second, it's in fall in Pisces, and Pisces is very abstract, right? Extremely abstract. And so when you have Mercury in Pisces, you get somebody who's a very abstract thinker, which is why it's in fall. Mercury wants to be logical. But not everybody has Mercury in the logical place. And logic also is something that's very structured, right? Which is a Saturn quality, which we'll get to later. So having a Mercury in Pisces, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not a logical thinker, or any other water sign for that matter. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Mercury wants to be logical, but it's not the only thing that signifies logic in a chart by any means. So Mercury is about thinking, translating, communicating, and then anything that has to deal with details and small finesse or nuance, right? And speed a little bit to an extent. So Mercury rules two signs. It rules Gemini, Virgo, mentioned this already, which means by extension, it's going to be in exile and detriment in Sagittarius and in Pisces. Now, Mercury is unique in that it is the only sign that is also exalted in its own sign. It's exalted in Virgo. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So let's talk about Gemini. Mercury rules Gemini. Gemini is a mutable air sign, which means it's reactive. It's air, so it wants to deal with other people. It wants to deal with the kind of intellectual realm, which is very fitting for Mercury, right? That makes a ton of sense. Gemini is very, very loves to talk and communicate, and it really embodies that messenger quality of Mercury. And it's very detail-oriented. I have a Gemini moon personally. It's going to notice a lot of details. It's going to pick up a lot of subtlety. And it's going to enjoy learning about all those details. Conversely, when it's in Sagittarius, the reason it tends to struggle is Sagittarius is about finding meaning. It's about finding truth. It doesn't really care about the details. It cares about the big picture, right? The gist of something. And so when you're trying to learn how to do your basic skills, you can't just know the broad strokes. I mean, there is some semblance of that, but knowing the broad strokes of how to, say, fold laundry, that's not going to help you fold laundry very well, right? It's a very basic, mundane skill, but that's the thing. Sagittarius is not really about that stuff. Sagittarius is about finding meaning. There's not really much meaning in folding laundry. Right? Other than you're helping somebody, or you're helping yourself maybe, doing your own clothes. So Mercury struggles in Jupiter signs, right? So then we look at Virgo. Why is Virgo both ruled by Mercury, but also the exaltation of Mercury? It's because Mercury wants to learn, right? Deals with learning, deals with thinking, and it deals with details. But what do you get when you put Mercury in an earth sign, right? That's mutable. Because mutable means it's change, it's reactive, it's flexible. Well, the earth signs deal with practicality, right? They deal with reality. So when you take Mercury, the planet of translation, you're translating what earth, reality, in a way that's flexible. So you get somebody who's practical and pragmatic, but has the ability to adapt and fine-tune and look at the details of things, which means Virgo is extremely practical and extremely good at making use of its intelligence, because it's taking the detail-orientedness of Mercury and applying it towards the real world. In Gemini's case, it takes the detail-orientedness and applies it towards the social and intellectual world, which is great. But the key difference between the intellectual world, the air signs, and the earth signs is the earth signs actually look at what works, what's practical, what's actually functioning, right? The intellectual world is all ideas and thinking, and that doesn't always translate to reality perfectly, right? Because it could be flawed. Whereas reality is you run into a brick wall, you run into a brick wall, right? There's no way of logicking your way out of that. It just happened. It's just, that's the reality, right? And so that's what happens when you get Mercury in Virgo, and why it's exalted in Virgo in addition to ruling is because you get somebody who's exceptionally practical, whose thought process is about finding solutions that make sense in a practical and real way. And it has the flexibility from being mutable where it can adapt. It can still take that mercurial, let me look back and reassess to find better ways of doing things. So it's superb in Virgo. And that's not to say everybody with Mercury in Virgo is some brilliant scientist or anything like that, but it's exalted there for a reason, right? And this is the reason. Now, conversely, that means when Mercury is in Pisces, you get Mercury in a sign where it's both in fall and in exile, right? So it's double whammy. Why is it so hard for it in Pisces? Because Pisces is abstract. Pisces is a mutable water sign ruled by Jupiter. So you get the sign that's watery, right, which is already intangible, intuitive, in a mutable place where it's naturally reactive, so something that's already kind of ambiguous and flowy and not really concrete is in a place where it's even less concrete, and then you get ruled by Jupiter, which is about kind of the big scheme of things. It's optimistic and expansive, and so it's just kind of spreading out in all directions. So what do you get? You get a Mercury, a thinking-oriented person who's just absurdly abstract, who's not thinking about concrete ways of doing things at all. It's total opposite of Mercury in Virgo. So this is why Mercury is in fall in Pisces. And that's not to say that it's bad, but it's just a very abstract thinker. It's not a, let me think about the practical way to do this. As a side note, I don't know if there's like definitive conclusive evidence, but there's definitely a lot of anecdotal evidence. A lot of astrologers seem to have Mercury in Pisces. So it's not a bad placement, but it does give a different flavor of thinking for sure compared to Mercury in Virgo. So the reason though it's in fall is because you put Mercury in Pisces and you're not really getting somebody who's let me think through the solution to this in a practical way. Like I said, it's very abstract. And it tends to be less, one of the issues is Mercury's quick, and it's going to move around a lot, right? Which means the mind is going to wander and think and change directions. And, we know how we are. Our minds are always thinking about a lot of different things. Well, you put it in Pisces, and Pisces is kind of always dealing with different things. It doesn't have an ability to hold on to anything. It just kind of floats along in the waves, and so you get a mind that's also wandering in a very, very circuitous way where it's not really in control of anything. Right? And so that's just another element of it. In terms of the houses, the first house is the joy of Mercury, which is interesting. It's the only house that is the joy, or let me rephrase this. It's the only angular house, that is the 1st, 10th, 4th, or 7th, that has one of the planets in its joy there. So what does this mean? It means that the first house in a lot of ways is very mercurial. It means that the first house has that same translative or filter process that Mercury has. This is why I personally tend to think of the first house as a filter, right? It's the framework. The rest of the planets and the signs in our chart are going to show us kind of who we are and how we operate, but the framework, the filter through which we have to do it into reality is all through that first house. And so Mercury is in its joy there because why? Mercury is a filter. It is a translator, right? It's translating who we are into reality, and that's what the first house in a lot of ways does. It translates all these kind of solar, conscious, subconscious thing going on inside of us into the real world. So that's Mercury, right? To sum up, rules Gemini, rules Virgo, exalted in Virgo. Mercury is about thinking, translating really specifically, thinking, learning, communicating, and then obviously any kind of fine, nuanced, detail-oriented things that kind of stem out from those things. So that's it for Mercury. Next episode, we'll look at Venus. I really hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you're looking for a reading, by all means, you can reach out. My email is james@jdastrology.com. And I think that's it for today. So thank you for listening.